Please welcome the panel on Innovators, Rethinking Criminal Justice Systems, moderated by Senior Advisor of Just Impact Advisors, Zach Carpenter.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining. My name is Zach Carpenter. I am a senior advisor with Just Impact. Basically, we're a fund that helps donors connect with criminal justice reform innovators and leaders. And so it's really a treat for me to be on the stage with these amazing leaders and innovators and entrepreneurs. And I'd like to introduce you to my left, Dr. Boz, who is the founding executive director of the Incarceration Nations Network. We have Hilton Freund, who's the CEO of the Twinning Project. We have Jessica Hicklin, the co-founder and chief technology officer of Unlocked Labs. Teresa Hodge is the president of Mission Launch, Inc. And at the end there, we have Ari Melber, who you may recognize, the Emmy-winning journalist, writer, attorney.
Hi.
And on the end is Alex Spiro, who's a world-renowned trial lawyer. We're thrilled to have you all here. Please give them another warm welcome. So our topic is innovation in criminal justice systems, which is funny because, as Hilton and I were just talking, this is a system that is fairly easy to say resistant to change, right? In the world of business, I think people understand that innovation has enormous value. If you don't innovate, you won't be competitive in the market. And in criminal justice, just for some context setting, things are a bit different. Since the 70s, incarceration has risen in the United States 500%. We currently are paying somewhere between $80 and $250 billion a year to support sort of the system and the things around it. At the same time, kids with incarcerated parents, 4% of them are graduating from college. Women's incarceration globally has risen 50% over the last 20 years. It's the fastest growing category of folks who are being incarcerated. And of the 10 or 11 million people worldwide who are incarcerated, more than half of them are there for nonviolent offenses, right? And if you walk into a courtroom in America, you'll see people using pen and paper record keeping. If you look at people who are being convicted of crimes and coming home, right, you'll see that there's essentially an absolute dearth of any kind of services or support for them coming home. And yet, there is hope. There is hope. There are really amazing innovations that are out there already and that are being developed by a lot of the folks on this panel. And so I'm excited to hear from you all about what sort of this toolkit looks like. So I want to start, Jessica, if you don't mind. There's a saying in our work that the people closest to the problem are closest to the solutions. And Jessica and Teresa are the two people on this panel, as far as I know, who have a lived experience with incarceration. So Jessica, I'd ask if you could just tell us what is the story that carried you through to the innovation and the work that you're doing now?
Sure, and thank you, Zach. So at 16, I went to prison on a life without parole sentence. At the time, that meant that I would spend the rest of my life in prison. Laws changed over the years, and after 26 years of incarceration, I finally had the opportunity to go home. I've been home for about 2 years, but the most startling fact that I will share with everybody is that during that entire 26 years of incarceration, I didn't have a single formal education experience. There's no preparation for me to return to society, no matter how committed I was to returning and being successful. And unfortunately, this, to build on what you were saying, Zach, this is the norm in our country. 3 out of 5 incarcerated adults are functionally illiterate. 7 out of 10 don't have a high school diploma. And less than 6% have access to higher education. It's an unsurprising result. 83% of the people released from prison in this country will be rearrested within 10 years. So when you talk about being closest to the problem, it's the life I lived, and it's the life that everybody around me lived. And so before I came home, I started the process of trying to solve that problem by building open source education infrastructure for American prisons with a focus on moving towards data-driven corrections. And we can get into this later, but the short version is if you ask any professional in the field why the 17% succeed, nobody can answer the question because we're not tracking, we're not correlating, we're not innovating in corrections. And so now I want to solve that problem.
Thank you. Teresa, if you could share what is the innovation and what draws you to it?
Yeah, well, first I wanted to say thank you to Milken Institute for allowing this conversation to take place. And I'm glad that I'm sitting next to Jessica because our two stories are very different. And I think that's one of the things that I often like to highlight is that when you think of 80 million Americans who have an arrest or conviction record, we're not one person. And so I went to prison at 44 years old, and I had a 5-year period where on the front side, I defended myself in a state case. I won the state case. It was repackaged as a federal case. I went to trial to defend myself and the company. We lost, and I was given an 87-month federal prison sentence. As a first-time white-collar, nonviolent person, I was the first person in my family to experience mass incarceration. What I learned from that experience was, or what I felt deeply, is I would survive prison because at 44 I took good skill sets to prison. I had a loving, supportive family, and I had friends and a network who I felt confident they would welcome me back. But I wasn't sure what surviving would look like, and I did not know the life I would have afterwards. Before I went to prison, I heard a statistic that said that if you have 10,000 hours of something, you're going to be an expert. Well, I was going to get 10,000 hours in prison, so I became an expert about prison. And the work that I do today is hyper-focused on reentry. It is, I want to make sure that when people return from prison, that prison doesn't have to ruin their lives for the rest of their lives. And I am today focused on creating solutions and opportunities day one. I read a statistic that said, if a person, when they're released from prison, do not tap into a meaningful opportunity and latch into community, that on day 100, they are closer to going back to prison. And to me, that's an indictment on all of us and not just that person. We have made coming home, returning, and connecting to resources very complicated. And technology, as you said, Zach, is underutilized in this space. So what I work on is hackathons. We do convenings. We bring lots of stakeholders together. And where technology can be interjected in the reentry process, we're looking for those solutions, and then we want to scale them across the country.
Thank you so much, Teresa. Boz, I want to turn it to you. We heard about data-driven corrections. We heard about the need for reentry. What's happening on a global scale, and what are you seeing are the needs abroad, not just in the United States?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So the needs are remarkably similar to what we see here in the U.S. I began working in the context of U.S. prisons more than 20 years ago, founded a program at John Jay College of Criminal Justice called the Prison to College Pipeline, which is a college program in prison that also guarantees people coming home access to university and when they come home. Ultimately ended up becoming very interested in what the world looks like in the context of this issue and wrote a book called Incarceration Nations, where I looked not only at how the crisis looks when we consider it transnationally, but specifically at the U.S.'s role in creating this crisis globally. Ultimately, that book became a network, which is Incarceration Nations Network, a global network of organizations, 134 of them in more than 46 countries doing different aspects of what we call criminal justice reform work and justice reimagining work. The reality is that the crisis looks remarkably similar from country to country. And so much of what has already been described in terms of, and we're only just touching the surface of the crisis that is reentry or reintegration, as the rest of the world calls it. The issues around lack of alternative to incarceration programs, programs, lack of access to education and particularly higher education programs. So you're seeing the same crisis from place to place, but what you're seeing that's quite different is actually, whereas I know that when I got going on this work and I was fundraising for Prison to College Pipeline 14, 15 years ago, it was very difficult to get funding. It wasn't a vastly popular issue. I got thrown out of room after room. That started to change, and I'm sure we'll talk about how that happened here in the US, that this became more of a front page issue. But in the rest of the world, no one cares, and you get thrown out of rooms for even suggesting that we care about people in prison. And so that is a massive crisis. The lack of funding opportunities, the lack of public conversation about this issue, and so on. But I think, and then I think why we should care globally, even if we take humanity, empathy, and love out of it, which, hey, some people do. Why we should care is, number one, I mean, if people are interested in investments abroad, if we're interested in seeing safe communities, which are the basis of any good business, of any society, we have to care about prison systems transnationally, A, and B, and we can talk about this some more, but we have to recognize that the US has exported. We are not only producing mass incarceration, over-policing, and all of that good stuff over here, we are exporting it globally. To the tune of, in the last 10 years, more than $5 trillion being spent exporting predominantly practices of building prisons, arming police forces globally in ways that are deeply, deeply harming communities all over, the exportation of the war on drugs. And so the idea behind Incarceration Nations Network and our approach to thinking about this is that we have to, number one, learn across borders, both about the problems and about the solutions, but also recognize our role in the global north, our responsibility in addressing the cleanup of this across borders, and also taking from our resources in ways that can benefit this crisis in a global context, because it really does look so similar from country to country.
Thanks so much, Baz. It's funny, we talked about the exportation of some of our worst policies. And just to your left, Hilton Freund is, I had a chance to speak with a few weeks ago, and it was one of the first times I've heard of a really exciting import of criminal justice reform. So Hilton, I wondered if you could just maybe tell us a little bit about how you're bringing sport and professional organizations into this fold.
Sure, Zach, thanks for that. I think just before I touch on that, I think the whole global nature of this problem is something that we need to address. I think most of us in this room probably know that this year over 60 countries are going to go to the polls. 50% of the world's population is potentially going to have an opportunity to vote on change. I would be surprised if in any of those election manifestos there isn't the line that goes, "We're going to go hard on crime." Mm-hmm. Okay, you don't get voted into power without putting that in your manifesto. The issue we have to deal with is, what does that hard on crime look like, and what does that hard on criminals look like? It doesn't necessarily have to be punitive. And what we have to establish is an environment where those serving custodial sentences have the opportunity to be upskilled, embrace employability, be educated, and ultimately be given the opportunity to find pro-social and productive pathways in community upon release. In order to do that, we have to see what switches the lights on. So in the UK, we launched our charity in 2018, essentially twinning professional, well, we call it football, you call it soccer, essentially twinning professional football clubs from the highest tier, the Arsenals, the Manchester Uniteds, the Liverpools, with their local professional prison, using the coaching teams from those professional sporting brands to go in and upskill the offenders that were nearing release through a course which was ultimately an entry-level football-based educational program, but with embedded functional skills like literacy and numeracy and team building and character building. The program proved incredibly successful across the UK. There's 92 professional teams. We work with 70 of them. Fortunately, about 3 years ago, I was invited to speak at the United Nations Convention on Criminal Justice, and our program was promoted and I was approached by the American Corrections Association. And in the last 18 months, we've launched with 10 of your soccer clubs here in the UK, and we're experiencing a lot of success with that. But I think the key thing behind it is understanding, as Zach said earlier, it's an ecosystem so resistant to change. It doesn't like to flex. It's always been an environment that is far more comfortable with the status quo. But if you always do what you've always done, you always get what you've always got, and we can't expect change. We need to flex. We need to bring that innovation. And what turns the lights on is when you can demonstrate to those serving custodial sentences that powerful sporting brands in community are still willing to work with them and deliver for them, that ultimately we get them to engage. Remember, these people were probably resistant to education prior to incarceration. So we have to do something different. We have to do something that's going to get them to embrace education whilst still serving their custodial sentences.
Thanks so much, Hilton. Ari, I wanted to ask you, maybe zooming out a little bit, you have a chance to sort of see a lot of the good work that's happening. You're also very aware of kind of what happens in an election year. I think I've seen some statistic that maybe there's a 700% or so increase in the number of mentions of crime in an election year, right? It's obviously a big topic. What's your view on sort of where we've come and where we are in this arc of innovation in this space? And then how do you think about uplifting working reforms and working innovations at the same time when there's a lot of fervor around fear-mongering and people being scared about crime?
I think there's been a real measurable shift in the discourse, at least between the two political parties in the United States, but not a ton of results yet. So that could be a part one, depending on what happens. I think it's great that everyone is in this room and you're all here and you care about this. There's a lot of other rooms right now. But one thing we should all work on if we care about this is a lot of the people who aren't in this room right now at this conference or who aren't watching and following this topic think of this as something that they can totally sit out, right? That this is just, people in prison or people who get out of prison, and then the rest of society is over here. And I think a lot of the great comments that were just made remind everyone that's not the case at the fundamental level of whether you care about each other in a society, and I'm still on that side of the fence. I know it's old-fashioned, so caring about all humans. But second, if you want to be a little more economic with it, and we are here at a conference with a lot of people who think about dollars and cents and ROI, the point about how people's children are affected and the workforce and the cost, all of these things affect everyone out there. So I think that's important to keep in mind. In my work, I worked at a public defender's, I did private practice, and now I do legal reporting and host a TV show. So I've been to one of the tech hackathons, by the way, years back in DC. Shout out to that. It was interesting to see. And I cover all this stuff. So yes, I think that the fundamental enduring problem, and I can't speak to all countries, but certainly in the US and I think in some other countries with similar political economic systems, is that the punishment, politically and otherwise, for even one story or one incident, God forbid how bad it might be, but the overall punishment for that, whether that's an employer saying, how could you even give this person a second chance? Look what they now did, or in the political context of someone who gets out and does something, is so much more severe than the reward for even positive things that would benefit the society, the community, et cetera. And so that imbalance is a problem. That story is a problem. And I was also thinking, listening to Elon Musk, I'm curious how many people caught any of what he said this week here. You know, I was listening to him. He made many great points, and one of his top lawyer and litigators is right here. So Alex knows all about how Elon thinks. But a lot of what I do is listen and report. I'm not always endorsing everything, but I thought he made a fair point without endorsing everything that Elon's ever said and done, which is he talked about how at its core, governments have this monopoly on violence. They operate as corporations with a monopoly on violence, and they do all these other things. And I thought that was a very fair point. And listening, I was thinking, a monopoly on violence and incarceration. And so most societies have those two prongs, and I think that is why this conversation and any change has to deal with state and federal government or international expectations as well. And we have to figure out what is that story. So in closing to the question you asked, I think for many years there was a bipartisan crackdown on crime in the US. And I think what's striking is there has been a push on the left and the progressive left on looking at this through a lens of structural change, BLM, discrimination against black, brown, and poor people, and that's very important. And on the right, there has been some, I wouldn't call it to the same degree, but some engagement on, well, part of the system doesn't work, part of it is unfair. I think the language and the framework's a little different, but that alone is a breakthrough compared to what I think was decades of one note. And again, people love to find binary differences. The truth is that the current Democratic president in the Senate passed a big crime crackdown in '94 with a lot of harsh rules, and his Republican opponent passed the First Step Act that had some changes. So I think the story is complicated, but the more that we can get a fact-based discussion of what works for the whole society, because the system obviously isn't working, the more you fix some of these things on the front end. We have to do the back end fixing because these people are people and they're alive and we have to deal with it. But even better to fix some of these laws up front.
Thanks so much, Ari. And Alex, you're a great lawyer and have a reputation as such. And as a former public defender, I was thinking about the story of kind of two systems of justice in America, where for the rich, you can hire good lawyers, you can get good representation, you can get better outcomes. And I think about being a public defender, I had hundreds of cases at one time. They actually did a study over the course of a year based on the people I represented and a 40-hour work week. I had 7 minutes per client, right? And I want to address the fact that, especially in the United States, I think black folks are 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than white people. Can you just speak to the issue of racial disparities in our sort of criminal justice system at large, and what maybe the legal profession or legal work can be done to address that?
Yeah, I mean, what you're pointing out is undeniable, right? The math is there. You don't just have to go to a courthouse in America. You'll see it. You see it ripple through the society at every level. And it comes, from the original founding of this country and all these backward-looking laws and it affecting poor communities, and it's just compounding upon itself. So that these communities then don't have dads and they don't have other things. They don't have resources, and the public defenders aren't funded. And this is a problem that has existed from the beginning. It's never been fixed. And frankly, when I was asked, do I want to sit on this panel, one of the things that is interesting about this room is you're bringing together two sides of this, right? I've met a lot of these folks or read about their work. They're normally presenting to people that are in the criminal justice world, that are already talking about it, thinking about it. This is a conference and a community of people that are not touched by this on a daily basis, of people of great means and resources. And this is a problem that's just sort of hidden. I mean, I know that it's caught wind in recent years, but it's still hidden. These prisons are in rural places, often on the grounds of old plantations and way out west, where nobody can get to them, and the people that are incarcerated, they don't have social media, they don't have spokespeople, and they just sit there, and we don't think about them. And so, if you could fix this system and everybody could go, be forced to visit, to get closer to it, to see it, to realize what this is all doing, I think that would be an important step to change. But what you say is unquestionably true. It's a different system if you're rich than if you're poor here.
And maybe I would open up the question to the panel who wants to answer it. Sort of, what would you suggest that folks can do who are, don't think day and night about criminal justice reform, who aren't working directly with folks who are directly impacted? What are ways for people to plug into this work, either through education or participation or action? Jessica, I'll turn it to you.
Yeah. Thank you. You could say I had a lot of thoughts on that. But I want to pick up on the fact that you pointed out that this is typically, this audience is not typically exposed to criminal justice and how it affects their daily lives. And so one of the things that people can do is consider this strictly from a financial standpoint. In this country, we spend $187 billion a year on corrections. So you can't say you're not touched because that's your dollars, that's going to the system that's failing. The other thing to note is that 95% of the 2 million people we have incarcerated will one day live next door to somebody And there's a good chance it's going to be somebody in this room. And so just becoming aware of the raw statistics about this system will help you realize that nobody in this country is untouched by criminal justice system. So if you're an investor in it, then speak up. Say what you want to happen with your dollars. Say that I don't want you to keep throwing it away. And I was actually thinking of an example earlier. If we compared criminal justice to AI trucking, for example, and we said we're going to spend $187 billion this year on AI trucks to move food for all of us, and you gave it to a company and they said, great, 17% of those trucks are going to work. The other 83, not so much, but don't worry, we'll get some more money from you next year to bring them in and try again. That's our correction system. That's what you're investing in. And so I would say two things. One, you're not untouched by it. And two, you do have a say-so in it. Every one of you has an elected official. Go to them and say, hey, I want to know why the 17 trucks work, 70% trucks work. And how do we invest in that? How do we increase that? Let's fix that.
Thanks so much. Yeah, Baz.
And I would add to that your taxpayer dollars are also going to support the funding of prisons and policing in other countries. So that is also your taxpayer money that is being funneled out primarily through various divisions of the U.S. State Department to pay for building prisons in Colombia instead of necessarily supporting the kinds of things. I mean, it's interesting because we in the U.S. are privileged to be able to even take government money for our work. In most of the countries where we work at Incarceration Nations Network, we can't really work with government, both because, as was pointed out several times, from a narrative perspective, it doesn't sell. And so I think that's another thing that you can all do, which is shift the narrative. Whatever you learn today or in other conversations, take that to people so that the people understand why prisons are not the answer. And again, even if we take the humanity and empathy out of it and we say this is not working, right? If it were run like a company, we would shut it down immediately with the kinds of rates, and they look worse outside of the US. So shifting the narrative, I often say that if I had $1 for every time I sat down with someone in government somewhere in the world, explained all of the possibilities of what you can do instead of building a new prison or investing more in corrections, and what community safety initiatives look like, and they say, yes, 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 great. And then when elections come, it's the same old tough on crime. Why? Because it sells. And so we have to think in that respect a lot more from the bottom up and shift the narrative and have these conversations with people. And I just wanted to also add to Alex's point and to the racial disparities of our system in the US. Obviously very true here, but that is a global reality. The most over-incarcerated people in the world, anyone have a guess who they are? What country? It's not the US, it's actually the Maori people of New Zealand, followed by Aboriginal people in Australia, followed by, and this is per capita, followed by people of African and Caribbean descent in Britain. So we're everywhere in the world, it's operating sort of very similarly in terms of a particular othered group. And sometimes most of the time that's racialized and genderized and so on, but sometimes it's class operating as race. And so the same nefarious structure is operating from country to country. And I definitely feel each one teach one is kind of corny, but it's also enormously effective that people need to start voting differently once they have the consciousness around the fact that this doesn't work, that it's grounded in a legacy of white supremacy, of colonialism, of racism, of all of those things. And it's not getting us the society that we collectively as a world want to live in.
I think I would add another point as well, which is, we've thrown a lot of data, so I'm going to add one more statistic, which is by the year 2030, 100 million Americans will have an arrest or conviction record.
Yes.
That is going to be 1 in 2 working age adults.
Yeah.
So why should we all care?
Yeah.
Because half of the population, when we think of them as consumers and as talent, will have an arrest or conviction record. So we have to rethink this problem. And it's a tremendous growth opportunity for many of the people who are here at this conference, if you have businesses, because if you want to grow your business, this is a talent pool that you're potentially going to have to pull from. And so whether you have to pull today or 5 years from now, if it's going to be 5 years from now, you need to start learning about this population, because again, 100 million Americans all over the country, it looks it's the same, and yet in certain communities where people return to, it looks different. Yeah. And so I think that there's a unique opportunity. I think that's why there are certain corporations that are doing second chance initiatives, because they're trying to learn and they're trying to get ahead of this so that they know. And it's what everyone says, that 95% of the people are returning home. You engage with this population anyway. We pump gas next to you. Yeah. We shop in grocery stores with you. Our children go to the same schools that your children go to. So we should care, because these are our fellow Americans, these are our fellow citizens, and our economy works better when everyone has an opportunity to work, earn, and live.
Hilton, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think at a macro level, I think we all have this expectation that our governments need to do more and our governments need to invest, but a criminal justice problem is a societal problem. And what we ultimately all want to achieve, and the way we shape the narrative, is to say that the work that we do in this ecosystem will ultimately create safer communities. As the panel have said, people who come out of prison will be living next door to us, will be on the sidewalk with us on Wilshire Boulevard. So what we have to do is shape the narrative. And there is this expectation that our governments don't invest enough, and that perhaps corporate America or corporate Britain doesn't invest enough. But the greatest challenge, and I speak from a bit of a personal experience here, is in philanthropy, where philanthropy that's targeted towards criminal justice is right at the bottom of the ladder. And certainly at a time in a world where we're experiencing a cost of living crisis, there's definitely a cost of giving crisis. People are thinking about how they give away their money to good causes. And, orphan children with diphtheria are going to be much higher on the ladder than somebody that's serving a custodial sentence. So I think there needs to be an educational exercise that takes place whereby society, community is informed that working with incarcerated individuals ultimately will create safer communities for us all to live in, but that it will need philanthropic support. Because as every single one on this panel has already stated today, the money's not coming from our governments. It just isn't.
Thanks, Hilton. So, as someone in philanthropy, I think the total average amount of money that goes into criminal justice philanthropy, with the wide definition, is about $400 million a year. Like I said, it's an 80 to, or Jessica has the better number, but it's between 80 and $300 billion a year industry just for what exists. I wonder if we could name specifically what institutions or what people, what positions are actually in control of whether to adopt new technologies that make a DOC process, Department of Corrections, the people who run the prisons, for example. Jessica, please tell me the actual statistic, but it's the amount of time that people spend in prison just waiting for their paperwork to process after the date that they should have been released already is something like...
Oh, that varies so much.
Is it like, is it 100 years? Is it a million years?
No, so ask the question again, their paper to process.
The people who spend extra time in prison.
Yes.
Because their paperwork hasn't processed.
Oh, thank you. No, so what Zach is talking about, we talk about systemic change, changing a system. You're not doing that overnight. And so when we talk about investing philanthropic dollars and making differences, we hope to mean today. And so as Unlock Labs did some of our research about how can we change the problem we're experiencing today, one of the things we found out is in the United States, 76%, or 3/4 of the states, have laws that say if somebody's a good person, if they go to prison and they start working on themselves, if they become a good person, they participate in their own rehabilitation, they can earn time off their sentences. Let's reward good behavior. Let's reward self-rehabilitation. And so 3/4 of the states have these laws. The problem is because we're not tracking what anybody's doing, we're not figuring out why we can fix the 17%. None of the laws are used effectively. So we did some research, and there's a couple other organizations doing this, and found out that if all of these earned credit release laws in the United States were properly implemented, there would be 350,000 years worth of time issued to people who they can come home that much earlier. It's easier to make this more concrete, though. State of Illinois, let's use them as an example. They recently passed laws saying this has to stop. The people said we want to reward people trying to work their way home. Department of Corrections, you must report on this. So we worked with the state and found out if everybody in the Illinois Department of Corrections currently incarcerated had one program a year, just one. It could be anger management, it can be good parenting, it could be any kind of program that is deemed worthy of credit, you would save 6,000 years of incarceration. Millions and millions of dollars. About 90 lifetimes worth of incarceration would go away if you simply tracked and provided access to rehabilitative programs. So that's the number.
Wow. Wow.
And that's
so then I think the question becomes, who are the decision makers? Where do decision makers sit who could adopt new technologies to fix that?
There's essentially two. Hopefully motivated by the folks in this room and the other folks. But essentially, you have the Department of Corrections Administration, typically a director of Department of Corrections, who ultimately has say-so about what happens inside their department, governed by their governor. So they can say, we want to adopt this solution. The problem is they can't adopt anything they can't pay for. And so it requires the legislature to allocate funds for that, which actually led to our business model, which is philanthropy as catalyst. We use philanthropic dollars to go into a state to deploy our technology in an institution to say, you don't have to invest in something that's unproven. Let us just work with your institution. So that's the director of Department of Corrections can make that choice to let us work with them. In fact, my team's currently in Maine right now having that conversation. And then if it proves out that it works, then we can go to the legislature and ask them, hey, and I love the investment question because there's this, well, we're not investing in this new technology. No, we're investing $187 billion. Let's just do that differently, right? Let's just change how we're doing that. So by using philanthropy, we can prove that we should redirect those funds to the innovations. And what we've found, using Missouri, my home state, as an example, we went in, we worked with the state, we worked with them for about 16 months, and we're able to show them that, hey, if you decided to invest in what we're doing statewide, it would cost you about $2 million. Which means basically we have to reduce the return to prison rate by about 3% for the taxpayers to get their investment back. 3% is nothing in this space. You give everybody access to a random education and you reduce return rate by 3%. So, yeah.
Thank you. Alex, I'm curious, on the other side of the coin, if money is the great motivator for the people in charge here, what role does sort of these big ticket lawsuits that have in sort of forcing systemic change? Have you seen that to be an effective tool?
It was in Mississippi. I'm fortunate to have at least some of my time spent suing prisons or taking on what I think of as impact cases. And I'm not doing anywhere near the good work the rest of you are doing. But in that limited time, if you may get enough attention on it and you make enough noise, people start paying attention and start asking themselves what is going on there, what's going on in those prison walls. And so when people saw on TV and in the news the photographs that were going on in the Mississippi prison system, I think that I don't care how unempathetic you are, you can't believe that's happening in America. I mean, there are people just dying on the floor, stabbing each other, running around. They don't have food, they don't have water, there's no health care. I mean, it's like you can't believe, it's hell on earth. And so once people saw that, then the Department of Justice woke up and everybody woke up. But the question is really, how do we wake everybody up without bringing them inside of the Mississippi prison system, which we did for a month. And what I always tell people, because this has come up a couple times, this concept of empathy, is try to picture people when they were kids, because people like kids, and so you see somebody in the community, you see somebody on TV who's a monster, you see somebody walking in the Tenderloin, and you ask yourself, what were they like as kids? What happened to them before the trauma, before whatever happened, the drugs, mental health issues. And I think if you can start doing that, that's the first step, because then you start thinking about it and contextualizing it and asking yourself, okay, like, does these tough on crimes and what I'm seeing with the homelessness, do these people all really just need to be arrested? Is that really what everybody's saying? Because that doesn't really this is a smart group of people. That doesn't really make much sense if you think about it. But you can't get to that point of thinking without waking up, either through an impact litigation or hopefully everybody in this room can start asking themselves, what's really going on here, and that's a person and what happened to them.
Can I add something important to that? What I've seen a lot of times is the images will get published of these kind of places, and the fear-mongering latches onto it and says, well, I don't want that person living next door to me, the people who are doing the stabbing and the killing and everything in the prisons. And the story's been reversed. No, I mentioned I did 26 years. What I didn't mention was 25 of those years were in Missouri's death row prison. It's considered the worst prison in Missouri. When I first came in as a teenager, that's what I saw. I saw stabbing and killing and everything else. But the other thing I saw was that as a victim empathy course was introduced that was created by the people incarcerated and education expanded, the Missouri prison system changed in the quarter of a century I was there. I never left the death row prison. I walked out of the death row prison into society. And the whole prison evolved because there was hope given back. And so don't, if you see those images, say, well, those people are clearly monsters. We've seen that. It's like, no, those people have no hope. They have no resources. They have no reason to care. We would all eventually be that way if you were struggling to survive.
Which is also why I think, the other thing that we collectively as a world need to be doing is investing in that level of organizing, investing in directly impacted leaders as the future, not only for this movement. I mean, I find it actually testament to how much of a crisis we're in, the amount of time that we have to spend explaining why this matters. Right? Justice is the bedrock of a society. How we deal with harm that's caused in our society, what we do with that, what our response is, that is the basis to our sort of social fabric. And I think when we think about people in prison, we have to think about them as organizers, as repositories of genius that have the capacity to change. And so I know that I think all of us who do this work spend a lot of time thinking about, gosh, is this working? What's most effective? This, that, and the other. And I think the piece of the work that we never have to doubt is that is supporting the leadership of those who have lived experience is always a win. We have, at Incarceration Nations Network, we have a fellowship program for formerly incarcerated leaders from around the world to come to South Africa, where our other base is, for 2 weeks. In fact, shout to Evie Ponder, our fellow from the US, one of our fellows from the US, who's here with me today. But these are all people who have endured prison systems around the world, not even just in the US, in the context of being on death row in Nigeria, in Kenya, and who are now making enormous amount of change in their communities. That is something that has a ripple effect on the movement. And I think overall, of the things to be sort of proud of in the US with relation to our movement, it was not always so that was the case, that directly impacted leaders were at the forefront of this. And I think, and historically, even when we look at the history of carceral systems in the US and globally, that's never been the case. Most reform movements have been like charity work from good, well-meaning liberal white folks. And so that shifted, and I think it's no accident that we are seeing a lot of needles being moved in the US. The key is that needs to happen across borders as well.
I can probably jump in there with what we're seeing in the UK, because I think you're absolutely right. I think there's been a propensity to offer work opportunities inside custodial environments which are not meaningful, and which people will often discount as something they don't want to do. Why would I do this? So you have to offer opportunities that those serving sentences want to engage with, and at the same time offer them routes through to employment that are going to be exciting. Because, if I use the UK as an example, people coming out of prisons, easy to get work on the railway, but they're not getting work in your finance team. And that doesn't work, because somebody might be bright enough to work in the finance team. What we're seeing with our project now is when we bring sport into it, that we're engaging these individuals to find opportunities throughout the sporting supply chain. So they're not going to come out and be professional soccer players. They're not going to come out and be professional coaches, but they now have access to meaningful work, whether that's in finance or logistics or hospitality or catering. What we can't do is demean people and say, just because you've been in prison, you can only do these menial jobs. We're not going to get them to engage that way. And there are plenty of people who have the ability and the propensity to take meaningful jobs and make productive pro-social contributions to our societies.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in real quickly there, is that's one of the reasons why what we're focused on today is the energy sector. The energy sector is raising their hand and saying that in the next 10 years, they're going to have a 22 million shortage of workers. 80 million people have an arrest or conviction record, 2 million people in prison. And so what we believe is that this is a prime talent pool. What Jessica and I can tell you is people in prison pretty much run the prison.
Yeah.
And so all the trades exist inside of a prison. I think the unique opportunity we have and what we need to take advantage of, and especially when we're thinking of innovation, is how do we bring more of the programming, more of the resources to the people who have nothing but time, and make sure that we start to maximize that time for them so that we can pipeline them to opportunities. What the energy sector knows is what I said, 1 in 2 working age adults is going to have an arrest or conviction record by the year 2030. So when you keep bringing the data back together, it's you have a problem and these people want to work. How can we help people who want to work, who have talent, get to work faster so that they can go back to being productive and take care of their families and lower the cost for all of us as well. And so we're really excited about this opportunity. We are using prison tablets and all forms, because what we also know is that the staff inside of prisons are understaffed.
Yes.
And so we're talking about innovation. We have to bring innovation inside of the prison facilities. And then when people come home, we have to make sure that they can continue, that there's a continuum of that innovation for them, and that we're connecting them to jobs quicker.
And to add to that, I think we have to say the word trauma and healing in that context, because too often, we can't finish this panel without saying those words, because too often people think it's just a simple mathematical equation of get people jobs, get people housing. And no, when you have, legacies of centuries of unhealed traumas that have been systemically inflicted upon you, you can get the best job in the world, the best housing situation, but until that healing happens, it's not that simple mathematical equation. So when we also talk about what we need to invest in, that is central to it. And that is healing and addressing of both the individual and the systemic trauma that prevents it from ever being just a simple mathematical equation.
Thanks so much, Dr. Baz. I sometimes think of the work that we're doing almost in the context of breaking a bad habit or healing from trauma or genuine transformation. It's very, very hard. And I think one of the things that's so clear and I'm so grateful for is there is an abundance of ideas, there's an abundance of work ongoing that could make this transformation. Ari, I want to ask you really 2 questions. What do you see as the biggest barrier to these great ideas making it through to a higher adoption or to scale? And then what is giving you hope that we can make it?
Well, the barrier is that even when you have moments of focus or change in the United States, the BLM movement obviously had this profound focusing effect. One of those rare times where people were looking at the same thing, watching the same video. Most of politics today is people watching different things, and to the extent they interact, screaming at each other about a different set of ideas, facts, primary source material, and then a lot of accusations and lies on top of that. I think because people were home, and the pandemic and the viral aspect, the right, the left, the center, the people who look at police videos and people who don't usually, were all saying, I saw the video, what did you see? How bad is this? And so you have this kind of breakthrough in those moments. So I think the hope answer is you can't replicate that, right? A lot of what happens in media and politics is everyone goes, that thing, we should do the MLK thing, we should do the thing in the 80s. It's like, well, no, that was a different time, that was different media, it was a different world. So I'm not saying you have to replicate that or that we can only have big national conversations during once-in-a-century pandemics. But the hope there would be that model, starting with facts, as gruesome as they were, was, a lot of people had a similar reaction to the video, which is it looked like a murder on tape. Okay, and we cover, among other things, the rate of officers who are actually convicted of murder on the job. And it's a very easy statistic to remember because on many years, for the entire United States, the number is 0. And then on a couple years, it will spike to 2 or 5. And the question for the law is not that you should root for a higher or lower number. The question is, how does this relate to any other factual legal environment? Because I can tell you the rate for doctors is much higher, right? And I think doctors, like police, have a hard job. But when doctors are found to have completely abused someone who is on the operating table and there's evidence of it or there's witnesses, the justice system kicks in a way that it doesn't traditionally for police. So I think that model for hope could be used in many other ways, meaning what we've heard our panelists talk about today, what actually is happening inside a prison, or what's actually happening with the racism and mistreatment of different people in different cases, or the actual way we're onboarding this incredible, almost ineffable spike in the number of incarcerated people in our country over the last few decades, not because the actual number of really bad crimes that probably need some treatment have spiked, but because our policies and our politicians have criminalized so much more behavior. So that's the hope side. The other question was what doesn't work?
What's the biggest barrier?
Yeah, I mean, the barrier is the flip side of that, right, which is even when you have those breakthroughs in a year or two, things really slide. And you have a New York mayor right now in a relatively liberal city, right, who's looking at, and the crime story's complicated, I'm not going to try to summarize it here, but basically is already saying, well, we really got to crack down on the crime or the migration or these things that you hear about. And that's a Democratic mayor. I don't think all these things are just blue-red. And so even when you get breakthroughs, in contrast to other issues, if you just compare this to, say, marriage equality, which at one point divided both parties, and then you have a breakthrough, and then I would argue the polling and the younger people, that issue is largely settled for a lot of people, and legally it's completely settled, right? And if you contrast that to this issue, you get a step forward sometimes, rarely, and then you get 2 steps back. And so I think that's a big barrier, and part of what we're talking about here, which is relevant to businesses, investors, and obviously media and politics and everyone else, is what's the story we're telling ourselves about how this actually works, and not giving in to someone saying, oh, well, those reforms must have failed and you got to backtrack and go all the way back to, I don't know, incarcerating everyone who tries marijuana. We tried that, and a lot of folks in a lot of states, red and blue, have said we could do better than that.
Thanks, Ari. There are still people, both millionaires from the cannabis industry and people serving prison sentences for cannabis possession. Alex, I wanted to ask kind of the same question. What is giving you hope, both from what you've heard today and as you think about what Ari said of retaining progress as opposed to letting it backslide? What is giving you hope?
Yeah, I think people are starting to look at things a little bit more through some of these lenses. I think mental health awareness. I think enough people have heard enough stories. You're not going to forget BLM, even if the statistics slide backwards. And so if a generation starts growing up with enough of this, I think it'll stick with them. And so I think you have that. But again, you're watching a political election year, and the media and what goes on TV and what's covered, again, has a certain shift and a certain focus, and that does not give a voice to the voiceless people that are in jails. Yeah. And you can't tell a comprehensive story in a 60-second clip. Yeah. And these are complicated, comprehensive stories that take time and energy. And so, there's always going to be that barrier. It doesn't surprise me. I didn't know those statistics that in lots of other countries that the minority population is always, right, subject to this. And you've got to ask yourself, it's so obvious that it would be, but there it is. There's the statistic. And so how do you counteract that and how do you deal with that? And, this is it's not a problem going away.
I think you make a good point, but I think as society, some of that responsibility needs to rest on us as third-party providers providing these services into these environments. We can't rely on the powers that be just to believe us. We have to measure what we do. We have to look at the data. We have to measure the impact. In philanthropy, everything you do is based on impact. When we can actually demonstrate the positives, demonstrate the impact, demonstrate the change we're making, maybe the conversation becomes a little bit easier. But right now, just to go and say, well, we need more money, we think it's going to work, we want to do this, it's not fair, nobody's going to listen to that.
Although that itself is unfair because actually given that their system is completely not doing what allegedly it's intending to do, the onus should really be on them to show that it works, not on the very sort of almost obvious things that we're doing that make sense on a 1 + 1 = 2 level. But sadly, that's the reality. I think also it's important to recognize, thinking about things that give us hope, I'm glad that at least in the US, a lot of the discourse is questioned now, and language is very, very important to this movement. Mm-hmm. The language we use when talking about people in prison, people coming out of prison, but also that we've even begun to, it's not second chances. That's like the most popular cliche in this movement, but it's first chances for people who are because of radical systemic inequality and racism, never got first chances. It's not rehabilitation. Like, aside from that being a very condescending term, who am I to rehabilitate you? It implies that you're broken and need fixing. The system needs fixing over and above the people impacted by it. So I'm glad that, and I think it's important, that we always express this as all of us have these conversations, that the discourse should shift and that we constantly question the language we're using in talking about this.
Are you hopeful we'll get there?
I remain an optimist.
The answer is yes.
I want to weigh in on what gives me hope.
Please.
I think conversations like this, we have to continue to have them. And then also, it's the fact that people are working, even on this panel, on a wide spectrum of the carceral system. And it's why I personally choose reentry. And I'll be honest, it's because it's a little bit lighter, quite frankly. I fought for a very long time for my freedom. And once I lost it, I was just really hyper-focused on rebuilding my life. Mm-hmm. And what I know is that the 2 million people who are sitting in prison, they're dreaming a dream. They're thinking about their life. And none of them are thinking, I can't wait to get out to come back home, period. And so I work on reentry because I know that the people who are in prison, they're hopeful today of their future tomorrow. And I want to do my part to create solutions for them, to create pathways of opportunity, to leverage my today's social capital, to bring awareness to this issue, and to provide an opportunity for partnership for any corporation who understands that 95% of this population is coming home, and there is a tremendous growth opportunity, and a just society creates opportunity for everyone. I personally believe America is a great nation, but a great nation has to take care of all of its citizens, and that includes individuals who have arrest or conviction records.
Thank you, Teresa. I think that's a great place to close us out, unless someone wanted to offer a final thought. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panel.
We hope you enjoyed the discussion. Please make your way to your next session.